Flint has a cultural center, the Vehicle City. Not a single public high school left in this town. The downfall of Flint started way before the water crisis. Parking for residents only, eh? Well, the only resident left here is this cat. Flint, Michigan, one of the most troubled cities in the United States. Let's go check it out. Currently, I'm standing outside of the Kearsley Reservoir that's behind me. This is off of Kearsley Creek, which feeds into the Flint River, not even a mile downstream of where the dam is, right back there along the road. If you can get that into the shot, maybe?
Nope.
I don't know. Well, I got a drone shot, so there you go. Oh yes, drone shots indeed. And there you can see the Kearsley Dam, which was built in 1929. Afterwards, Kearsley Creek winds its way over to where it drains into the Flint River, which is right by where the Flint Water Treatment Plant is located. Two other reservoirs are located not that far upstream along the Flint River, the first one being C.S. Mott Lake, constructed in the 1970s for recreational use, and in the background you can see the Flint River glistening in the sunlight as it heads towards the city, with the Flint skyline taking a commanding view in the background. Actually, you kind of have to zoom in to see it a little bit. But yeah, anyway, further upstream, miles away from Flint, is the almighty Holloway Reservoir, and it's actually closer to the city of Lapeer than it is to Flint. It's also the largest of the three reservoirs by far and away. And upon completion in 1955, Holloway, along with the Kearsley Reservoir, were both intended to be the primary water supply for the city of Flint. With that said, now we're going to head back into town. Construction on the water treatment plant was completed in 1954, but after completion of the plant, officials in the 1960s determined that the water from the Holloway and Kearsley reservoirs wasn't going to be enough of a supply for Flint to use in the future, as during that time the almighty Flint metropolis was growing faster than most other populated areas were in the nation. So, in 1967, Flint signed a contract with the city of Detroit to supply water for them. And that's how things were for the next 47 years. During that time stretch, the Flint Water Treatment Plant was, quote-unquote, maintained to be used as a backup water supply for the city. However, the treatment plant went mostly unused, and it basically ended up sitting there wasting away, deteriorating over the years. Well, off we go on our tour of Flint's far north side. This is my fourth video in my Flint series, and much of this part of town that we'll see in this video has long been considered as one of the worst areas in Flint. And along the way, I'll be talking about all of the factors and how the Flint Water Crisis occurred. We start the tour right by where I was standing in the opening shot to this video, and here's yet another view of the Kearsley Dam, once again constructed in 1929, and it has had its own set of troubles in its history. The city has long neglected the dam with poor maintenance over the years, and in 2017, after a routine adjustment was being made to the water levels of the lake, a gate became stuck open, which drained the lake to levels that were so low that a car was exposed from the lake bed. In 2018, the Flint City Council approved a project to repair the dam, but once those repairs were underway, it was discovered that the dam needed even more repairs than what was originally thought. That's what happens when infrastructure that was built in 1929 gets neglected for so long. And speaking of neglected infrastructure, let's move on to talking about the Flint Water Treatment Plant. Now, it's important to point out that a lot of water safety regulations have changed since Flint's Water Treatment Plant was first opened back in 1954, so a new water treatment facility in 2022 would look much different than a new one would have looked like in the 1950s. And it goes without saying that technology has much improved since then. I mean, you would hope so anyway, right? Well, on April 25th, 2014, the city thought that it would be a good idea to stop buying water from Detroit, which in return ended up being arguably the worst decision made by a government entity in our nation's history, and that's the day when the switch was made to use the old treatment plant that was built by 1954 water safety standards and once again was a largely deteriorated facility as it went mostly unused throughout the course of its life. To give this event some more context, the switch was made while the financial decisions for the city were being made by an emergency manager that was assigned to them by the state. Flint was actually under its second stint of emergency management at the start of the water crisis, the first stint being from 2002 to 2004 and the second one being from 2011 to 2018. Now, during this second stint, Flint saw 4 emergency managers running the show during a 7-year time stretch. It was like a game of musical chairs or hot potato. Neither Ed Kurtz, Michael Brown, Darnell Earley, or Gerald Ambrose wanted to continue holding the responsibilities for too long. They said,
"Nope."
Yet all 4 made some very bold decisions that affected the community in negative ways in order to manage the city's finances, and there's never a good way for a city to make budget cuts, but that's no excuse for what ended up happening to Flint's water. The emergency managers were assigned to Flint by then Michigan Governor Rick Snyder. Knowing that, the goal of an emergency manager is to cut costs so that a city can better manage its budget. The end goal was for Flint to be able to use Lake Huron as its primary water source, as a deal was made a few years prior for a new pipeline to be built by the Carignaty Water Authority to supply Flint and Genesee County with water from Lake Huron. And until that could be complete, the Flint Water Treatment Plant was going to be used temporarily. And this move in the long run was projected to save $200 million for the city of Flint. Not to mention that in 2013, when Ed Kurtz signed off on Flint moving away from Detroit Water, Flint residents and businesses were paying 5 to 6 times more in their water bills than any other customer of Detroit Water was throughout Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties. Meanwhile, I was heading east on Carpenter Road from Dort Highway, and I came across this abandoned party store, where vegetation has completely taken over. Currently, we're on the far northeast side of Flint, and you can't get any further in the northeast direction in the Flint city limits than where we are right now. But here's yet another abandoned school, this one being the old Carpenter Road Elementary School. The city announced the closure in 2015 along with 2 other schools at the time. An MLive article states that the Flint School District was facing a $21.9 million deficit, and it did in fact occur when Flint was under emergency financial management. Well, the reason why Flint was in a financial crisis to begin with can be understood when considering that General Motors today has much less of a presence in the city than it once did. GM used to employ 80,000 workers in Flint, yet today only 7,500 in all of Genesee County work for General Motors. But over time, GM closed their factories, and as the jobs disappeared, so did the tax dollars that funded the city, and needless to say, the residents left too. Nearly 200,000 people used to live in Flint, but today only 80,000 people are left, while that number continues to decline. By the way, I've talked about the history of General Motors and the company's relationship with Flint in my last couple of videos, so make sure to check out those in my Flint playlist that is linked down below if you want to hear more about how Flint started to decline. Now we're back on Dort Highway heading south before heading west across Flint's north side along Pearson Road, which is one of the city's main east and west thoroughfares, and remember that all of the lost footage that I skip over in order to make these videos shorter will be available on my second channel called Chris Harden's Travel Archives, once I'm done uploading videos in my Flint playlist. But yes, anyway, the switch to use the Flint water plant was made on April 25th, 2014, and it was only supposed to be a temporary switch, as a new pipeline was being built from Lake Huron to be the new primary source of water for the city. And they had already ended the contract to stop using Detroit's water, so they had to use some source of water before the new pipeline was completed. However, as soon as the switch was made, residents immediately noticed a brown color to the water that was coming out of the faucet. Not only that, but it had a very noticeable odor. And of course, that's in spite of Flint's mayor releasing a statement shortly after the switch. Despite the city's mayor at the time, Dane Walling, making that statement, and in spite of Walling being the one who pressed the button to officially make the switch, the responsibility for the decision to make the switch was more so on multiple people and events leading up to the case, rather than just one individual. I've mentioned many of those events leading up to the switch, and I've mentioned several of the people who have played a role in the decision-making to switch the water. Later in the video, I'll dive more into the legal mess, which at this point seems like it'll be in court until the year 2083, but as time went on, investigations uncovered some emails that were sent to the decision makers warning them to not make the switch, as the Flint Water Treatment Plant was not ready to handle the task at hand. But officials at the time were so eager to press that button, and they were so proud to be saving millions of dollars by being able to supply water for themselves, while others, who might have been seen later as whistleblowers, were pressing a different button, that being the panic button. Those warnings were ignored by the ones in power, and the switch was made anyway, despite the warnings. Along with that, there was very little testing being done at the Flint Water Treatment Plant beforehand to make sure that the water was safe to use. Michigan Radio reported that officials also didn't immediately treat the water to ensure that it didn't cause corrosion in the pipes, and that they were taking a wait-and-see approach. Yeah, imagine your city saying, "Let's not do the proper testing before switching our primary water source. Let's just wait and see if the water being drawn raw won't corrode the pipes that were built in the early 1900s and are made of lead." Yeah, sounds like a great idea, not? Because once the improperly treated water has gone through, all of the pipes have been corroded, and lead is tainting all of the water that is being sent to the residents and businesses of Flint. And the only solution now is to replace all of the lead water mains in the city. Not to mention all of the individual plumbing that would eventually need to be replaced for all of the houses and other buildings in town. To the right is the abandoned Bryant Elementary School, which closed in 2014 and is falling apart right in front of our eyes. Anyway, in August of 2014, the city was forced to elevate the levels of chlorine that were used to treat the water in attempts to get rid of an issue with high bacteria. But that didn't solve the issues with the water, because that only created new issues. More on how this affected human health issues in a few, but in October of 2014, General Motors stopped using Flint's water at their last remaining plant in town because it was corroding their equipment. This picture here by flintwaterstudy.org illustrates the corrosion that Flint's water caused on metal. The nail on the bottom was exposed to Flint's water for a month, while during the same time frame, the nail on the top was exposed to Detroit's water, or Flint's original water source, when it was safe to use and drink. Fast forward a year, and at this point, the switch was made. There was no going back, and the damage was done. In this year of 2015, researchers from Virginia Tech collected water from 252 homes. The data had showed that lead levels had spiked in the tap water citywide, with 17% of the samples coming in above the federal action level of 15 parts per billion, which is the level that corrective action must be taken according to the federal law. And experts in the field will tell you that the level of 15 parts per billion needs to be much lower than that. Well, anyway, over 40% of the samples showed a measurement of lead above 5 parts per billion. That alone suggested what these researchers called a very serious problem. There was even one home where the water was tested and the results showed 104 parts per billion of lead contamination. That's something that should never happen. A separate report came out in September of 2015 by Flint pediatrician Monahana Atisha, and this report stated that there were nearly double the amount of children citywide that saw elevated levels of lead in their bloodstream since the city switched the source of the water back to the Flint River. The report also stated that there were certain neighborhoods in Flint that were worse than others. Hannah Atisha said that lead is one of the most damning things that you can do to a child in their entire life course trajectory. Most of us knew that, though, given the history of humans having a wide-scale use of lead in prior generations through paint, building materials, gasoline from our vehicles, and utility pipes, among other things. Anyway, there were nearly 9,000 children in Flint under the age of 6 that were exposed to lead-contaminated water during the years of 2014 and 2015. Now, the lead water problem in Flint is something that most people in the country know about, except for the ones that live under a rock. What people might not know about is the outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. And upon the switch of the water supply to the Flint River, Flint saw a huge spike in Legionnaire's disease. In fact, it was the third largest outbreak of the terrible disease in U.S. history. This is because in August of 2014, high E. coli levels were reported along with a high level of fecal coliform bacteria. Now, excuse me while I go throw up in my mouth. Alright, I'm back. Well, how disgusting is it that any city in the United States, let alone Michigan, which is surrounded by the Great Lakes, which contains about 21% of the world's supply of surface fresh water, has to deal with such a health crisis that stems from its own public water supply? Well, if you're unsure of what Legionnaire's disease is, it's a severe form of pneumonia. The disease is said to have caused 12 deaths along with making 90 other people sick between June of 2014 and October of 2015. However, other data suggests that the death toll was much higher, although not official, as Legionnaire's can sometimes be mistaken as regular pneumonia, as the two diseases are closely related, because Flint also saw a large increase in pneumonia cases during the 18 months that Flint was getting its water from the Flint River. During this time frame, 115 people died of pneumonia in the city of Flint alone. Here, you'll see that I skipped the video from where we were on the west side of the city back to the east side before I head west along Carpenter Road, which is a thoroughfare that serves as the northern boundary for the Flint city limits. So yes, back to the talking points, as Legionnaire's is not a disease that is passed around like COVID-19 or the flu. Rather, it's caused from a bacteria called Legionella pneumophila, which grows in the water. The bacteria can enter the lungs through tiny droplets, like if you were to inhale mist from a sprinkler or a fountain that was contaminated. In this case, you would want to wear your mask outside. Well, the bacteria can also enter the lungs if maybe you end up choking while drinking. But just like with most major illnesses, if there's a underlying health issue or if one has a weak immune system, then inheriting Legionnaire's disease can cause even more severe symptoms. Anyway, multiple research groups from major universities across Michigan and the country have found that the Legionnaire's outbreak was indeed connected to the water being supplied by the Flint River, as the number of cases went back down to where they should have been once Flint stopped using the Flint River as a water supply. Legionnaire's disease overall is a pretty rare illness to come across. For example, in Flint, before the water crisis occurred, there were typically 6 to 12 cases of Legionnaire's throughout a given year. However, during the water crisis, Flint saw 45 cases per year. And of course, a much higher scale of pneumonia cases to go along with it, in which some of those pneumonia cases could have easily been mistaken for Legionnaire's. But believe it or not, Legionnaire's, pneumonia, and lead poisoning were not the only health issues. As I mentioned before, the city raised the levels of chlorine to treat the water as it was full of awful bacteria because the city wouldn't treat it properly to begin with. And the increase in chlorine created elevated levels of trihalomethanes, which is a cancer-causing chemical that is a byproduct of chlorine when mixed with water. And now we go back to heading west on Carpenter Road, which has more trees and overgrown vegetation than it does occupied homes and businesses. It's also important to keep in mind that we will probably never know the exact number of people that the Flint Water Crisis has affected. We're probably never going to know how many true cases of Legionnaire's disease that there were, any cases of pneumonia, nor are we going to know how many children exactly were poisoned by lead. All we know is that it's been way too many people, and it's a very sad and unfortunate circumstance. Meanwhile, to the right is the former Flint Northwestern High School. It's the only plot of land north of Carpenter Road that's officially within the Flint city limits. The school's athletic teams went by the Wildcats and the colors were green and white. Northwestern opened in 1964 and it's had multiple names over the years. In 1999, the school signed a contract with Edison Learning Incorporated, which is a management company that helps improve schools. At that point, it was called Flint Northwestern Edison Community High School. In 2005, the name changed to Flint Northwestern Preparatory Academy, and in 2018, the school officially closed. And among the most notable alumni is boxing champion Clarissa Shields. And now we're in the northwestern corner of Flint city limits, heading south on Clio Road, which is an extremely depressing-looking thoroughfare with abandoned shopping centers and other retail buildings on either side of the road. Well, even more studies have shown that the reason why the water that was treated from the Flint River needed such extreme levels of chlorine to kill the bacteria were from the fact that the lead pipes were already corroded, so this could have been avoided if the proper testing was done in the first place. This was purely an issue of failure to complete routine water safety tasks from a human standpoint. It's not like the Flint River is more polluted than any other river in this country. It's actually not, especially from where the water was drawn from, as the location was upstream from the city of Flint and all of the old GM factory locations. But no, chlorine would react with the iron and lead from the pipes that were exposed due to the corrosion, meaning that there wasn't much chlorine left to fight off the bacteria, which means that extreme levels of chlorine were needed in order to fight off the bacteria that was causing the Legionnaire's outbreak, which in return caused the higher levels of THMs, so you can see how this ended up being a huge disaster with no practical solution other than to switch the water back to its original source, along with replacing all of the corroded lead pipes throughout the city. Meanwhile, during the time when this was presently going on, there were multiple officials that were interviewed and asked about the water, as residents were showing brown water coming from their faucets and complaining about the odor and assuming that the reasons why they were sick was because of the water, only to hear these officials tell the public that the water was safe to drink and that it wasn't contaminated with lead. It seemed like all of the efforts by these public officials were being made to cover up the issue, or to not admit that they made one of the biggest mistakes in our nation's history. For example, Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy spokesman Brad Werfel said, "Let me start here. Anyone who is concerned about lead in the drinking water in Flint can relax." Yeah, okay, Brad, who are you, Aaron Rodgers? Brad must have not lived in Flint. He must have not had to have used the water on a daily basis. He says that note as the department showed two water samples. One of them was a sample from a water filter and another came from a business rather than a home, so they weren't true samples of the water that was being sent to the homes throughout Flint. On October 16, 2015, Flint switched their primary water supply back to Detroit's. Side note, as at this point, Detroit had gone through bankruptcy and their water supply was now called the Great Lakes Water Authority. Although it was pretty much the same source of water, the only difference is that it was no longer funded by the city of Detroit, rather through a separate entity, that being the Great Lakes Water Authority. Well, this water was treated properly with the right amounts of corrosion control and chlorine levels, and it was safe to use and drink. However, you already know what I'm about to say, as the lead pipes in Flint were already corroded, not to mention the buildup of bacteria that has grown throughout Flint's water system, so there was still a lot of work that needed to be done, as high lead levels continued to appear in water samples. On December 14, 2015, newly elected Mayor Karen Weaver declares a state of emergency, and around the same time, then Michigan Governor Rick Snyder created the Flint Water Advisory Task Force to address the issue. Shortly after, our friend Brad is told to relax himself, as he was no longer in his position that he was in before. He, along with a few others, had officially resigned from their positions within the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. In January 2016, both Snyder and then-President Barack Obama declared a state of emergency in Genesee County due to the poor state of the drinking water in Flint. This allowed FEMA to provide equipment and resources to Flint residents through federal funding. This included water bottles and water filters at no cost to Flint residents. On January 21st, only a few weeks later, the EPA issued an emergency order, stating that the city of Flint and the state of Michigan have failed to respond properly to the water crisis. On February 17, 2016, Snyder admitted fault publicly by saying that he and other employees for the state of Michigan had failed the families of Flint. Public Act 436 that went into effect when Snyder was governor of Michigan in 2012 allowed the state to have stricter control over cities that are going through what Michigan calls a financial emergency. Emergency managers were already a thing before Snyder was elected as Michigan's governor, but this act gave emergency managers more power. And keep in mind that these emergency managers are not elected locally, rather they are appointed to a city from the state. So in many ways, it was the state of Michigan that was responsible for the water crisis rather than the city of Flint. So the year of 2016 ended up being a year where Flint residents banded together to file lawsuits against government officials. So the question is, who is being held responsible for the decision to switch Flint's water supply over to the Flint River, which in return ended up being one of the worst decisions and one of the largest breaches of public trust in U.S. history? Well, according to this WDIV article from January of 2021, this article states that there are 9 people that were indicted on 41 total counts. The people involved includes Snyder, who was charged with 2 counts of willful neglect of duty, each a 1-year misdemeanor and/or a $1,000 fine. Former director of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Nicholas Lyon, who was charged with 9 counts of involuntary manslaughter, each a 15-year felony and/or a $7,500 fine, plus 1 count of willful neglect of duty, which is a 1-year misdemeanor and/or a $1,000 fine. Former chief medical executive of MDHHS, Eden Wells, who is also charged with 9 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 2 counts of misconduct in office, each a 5-year felony and/or a $10,000 fine, and 1 count of willful neglect of duty. Current Early Childhood Health Section Manager of MDHHS, Nancy Peeler, with 2 counts of misconduct in office and 1 count of willful neglect of duty. Former Director of the City of Flint Department of Public Works, Howard Croft, with 2 counts of willful neglect of duty. Former Transformation Manager and Senior Advisor for Governor Snyder, Richard Baird, with 1 count of perjury, a 15-year felony, 1 count of official misconduct in office, 1 count of obstruction of justice, and 1 count of extortion, a 20-year felony and/or a $10,000 fine. Former Director of Communications and former Chief of Staff for Governor Snyder, Jared Agin, with 1 count of perjury. Former City of Flint Emergency Manager Gerald Ambrose with 4 counts of misconduct in office, and former City of Flint Emergency Manager Darnell Early with 3 counts of misconduct in office. Now, with that said, not long before the time of me uploading this video, on October 4th of 2022, Genesee Circuit Judge Elizabeth Kelly had dismissed criminal charges against 7 of the officials that I just mentioned. This was expected after the Michigan Supreme Court stated in July of 2022 that the indictments had been arrived at improperly. However, the charges were dismissed without prejudice, so that means that these officials can be charged again with a crime. The Michigan State Supreme Court claimed that the problem with the indictments was that they were decided upon by a 1-person grand jury. A 1-person grand jury is seldomly used. In fact, Michigan is one of only 3 states that occasionally uses a 1-person grand jury. It's where a single appointed judge reviews evidence out of public view and decides on charges. Using a 1-person grand jury delays the process. However, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that a 1-person grand jury does not have the power to issue indictments. So even though the case was dismissed, these officials that are thought to be responsible for the Flint water crisis can still be charged with misdemeanors and felonies. It's just that we have to wait to see that happen, if it ever does happen, that is. In November of 2021, a federal judge approved a $626 million settlement for Flint's residents that were affected by the water crisis, and the settlement allows families who had young children at the time to receive more money. even though no amount of money can undo the damages of lead poisoning to the brain of children at incredibly young ages. That lead poisoning will affect them throughout their entire lives, and that's why so many Flint residents are angry and want to see justice served over this neglect of responsibility by the state. And it's also why so many Flint residents want to see the emergency manager laws in Michigan either get revised or completely disappear so that nothing like this can ever happen again. So another question that comes up with the Flint Water Crisis is whether or not all of the lead service lines have been replaced. Well, in 2017, a court order required the city of Flint to replace all of their lead service lines with the public water system. According to Flint, in January of 2021, 9,912 lead pipes had been completely removed and replaced, which is about half of the estimated 18,000 lead pipes within Flint's water system. However, some of those lines might include homes that are either unoccupied or ones that might not currently have active water accounts with the city of Flint. And if you've been looking around throughout this video, you've been able to see that there are a lot of abandoned homes and vacant lots within the residential areas of the city of Flint. Now, according to Flint's website, a homeowner or resident of at least 18 years of age must be home and must be able to give permission to excavate and replace a service line. The article continues to state that the property owner will continue to own and be responsible for the water service line between the curb stop and the water meter inside the home. Later on in the article, it states that an owner will be provided with a water filter and that it must be used for 6 months after service line replacement. Moving on now to April of 2022, and the city of Flint claims to have replaced 10,088 lead pipes with an estimated 1,900 homes that still need pipe replacement work under the agreement that was set back in 2017. In November of 2022, it was reported that 95% of Flint's lead service lines have been replaced, not to mention the deadline originally being January of 2020, and then November of 2022, and then September of 2022. Well, now the deadline is May 1st of 2023, but nobody believes that it will be completed by then given how slow the progress has been, and given the fact that the city has failed to meet the 3 previous deadlines. There also hasn't been accurate records being kept of the progress that's been made on replacing the lines, so that also makes people question whether or not Flint is even 95% of the way done. So is the water safe to drink in Flint, Michigan? With 95% of the lead service lines being replaced as so claimed by the city, with over $400 million in state and federal spending to replace the lead service lines over the last 5 years, is the water safe to drink? Well, whenever you look this up, you get conflicting reports. Water samples show that Flint's water clearly meets the federal regulations, as the vast majority of homes show that lead levels in the water were at 5 parts per billion or better back in December of 2020, and the rates have only improved since then. With me uploading this video in November of 2022, the issue currently lies on the public's trust of the government. People must ask themselves if they trust what is being told to them about the quality of the water that's being sent to their homes. And you can't blame them if they don't trust the government's word, because they were lied to for multiple years when the city switched the source of the water to the Flint River, and the years afterwards, leading into the investigation, leading into the charges that were given to the people in control at the time. During the time of the crisis, residents were told that the water was safe to drink when it absolutely wasn't, so how are you going to realistically expect them to trust the government when they're being told that the water is safe to drink again? It's something that's going to take time. You have buildings in town like the Durant, which is one of the city's most historic buildings, that says on their website that the water is safe to use and drink. And it probably is. It's sad that you have to put that on a website and put it on the front page, but even with that, can you get over that voice in your head that tells you not to drink or use Flint's water? I don't think I could personally. I wouldn't even be able to stay in a hotel for a night in the city limits of Flint and drink the water there just by knowing everything that's happened in Flint in recent history. I wouldn't be able to take a shower. I wouldn't be able to do anything with water. I think I'd rather bathe in Mountain Dew before bathing in Flint's water. Well, on the bright side, if you want to entertain a bright side that is, the Flint Water Crisis served as a wake-up call for not only the rest of Michigan, but also for the rest of the country. The issue of lead service lines has been swept under the rug for decades across many communities in this country, as debt continues to pile up for not only the United States as a whole, but for many of these smaller municipalities as well. Anyway, now that the country has an example to look at in Flint when it comes to their service lines that are made of lead, it's now up to everyone else on whether or not they want to act on replacing their outdated lead service lines. They have a decision to make. These municipalities spread throughout the country can either replace their lines if they are made of lead and if they're not safe to be drinking water from, or they can continue to act like it's not going to happen to them, even though it probably will over time as these pipes continue to be more and more so outdated. And whenever that time comes, these local cities, towns, and other forms of municipalities will have to pay the price whenever the issue arises. But the problem is that these lead service lines are mostly located in poorer communities such as Flint, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore. The list goes on and on. It's tougher for these poorer communities to muster up the funds and resources required to replace all of their lead service lines than it is for wealthier communities. With that said, the state of Michigan implemented a law that states by the year 2041, all lead service lines must be replaced. Now, no other state has a timeline like Michigan does to replace all of their lead service lines, as the state tries to avoid another public embarrassment and being responsible for a major health issue like with what happened in Flint. Michigan has also been putting in more noticeable efforts than any other state to find these lead service lines and replace them, along with testing the quality of water. Nationally, there have also been efforts to put a timeline in place to replace all of the lead service lines in use that are across the country. There are thought to be anywhere between 6 to 10 million lead service lines in the United States, and that is going to cost billions of dollars to replace them all. Most of these lead service lines, by the way, are east of the Mississippi River, as the eastern half of this country was developed before the western half. But we might not see all of the lead service lines be replaced throughout any of our lifetimes, but the Flint Water Crisis will surely be looked at in the history books for generations to come as an issue that changed our country moving forward. I do end the video here, and to see more of Flint's North Side, make sure to check out my second channel, which is called Chris Harden's Travel Archives, and that will be linked down below, as once again, when I'm done uploading my 9-video Flint series, I will have a video that shows all of the extra and unseen footage that I filmed while going through the entire city of Flint. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, as doing all of those things helps these videos destroy the evil monster that is the YouTube algorithm. Also, make sure to hit that notification bell and select yes so that you can be notified every time that I upload a new video. If you enjoyed this video, then you might enjoy checking out some of the featured playlists on this channel. Videos with amazing insights on other places like what you saw here can be found in my Flint playlist, my Michigan playlist, or in my American Hoods playlist. Last but not least, if you can't get enough of me on here, you can always go follow me on my other social media accounts, and those links are below. We'll see you next time. Peace!